Good evening. I appreciate your patience. I promise I'm not that bad with time. I'm a little bad. But we've been stalling a little bit to have our final panelists join us, and I'm hopeful that that will happen here momentarily. But I appreciate your patience as we do that, and I want to welcome you this evening to Castleton United Methodist Church for, it is hard to believe, but our fourth and final installment in our housing series. And I can tell you it is so good to see many familiar faces, but also some folks maybe here in person at least for the first time. I want to thank you for joining us as we talk today about housing and the role in government. And my name is Laura Wilson. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Indianapolis. And as a political scientist, I absolutely must say, I think we saved the best for last. If you've been able to attend, I see some panelists from previous cycles. In many panels, one of the questions I asked, and we'll still ask it this evening, were what were challenges, what were barriers, what were opportunities? And you often heard, I think over and over again, how important policy was and leadership. And I can tell you I'm joined by many esteemed leaders, both in legislative and judicial roles, in the private sector, right, and also in public here on stage. So we'll be able to delve much more into those kinds of policy issues tonight. As I tell you this, I want to let you know, just a few reminders, and if you've been here, you know I've talked about these, but we are still partnering up with Gleaners throughout the rest of the month of August for our food distribution. And Pastor Matt shared this with me, which I think is really exciting. Last week, we served 546 families. Today, and you know how hot it was today, I think it was like 94 degrees, very hot, right? We had a record 602 families. So yes, that is absolutely worth an applause. Right. So we're doing this actually just up the road. And so this food distribution program is in the shopping center parking lot at 75th and Shadeland. It's every Tuesday from 3 to 5, and actually setup starts at 2. And something I appreciate that they've been saying in church is if you can't make it for the entire time, even if you can come for an hour or two, to give the time that you have. I'd encourage you to consider doing that. You can sign up if you go to castletonumc.org/gleaners. You can also just show up if you're able to. I want to let you know, in addition to that, I mentioned this is our fourth and final forum, and I know y'all can do math too, so that means we've had 3 previous forums. If you want to catch any of those, we've posted them all online, and again, they're on our website at castletonumc.org if you go to /housing. And we'll continue to take an offering for the Lawrence Schools Emergency Fund. If you were here in our first panel, we talked about, in particular, how that money can be so beneficial for the schools. And when it's the emergency fund, it gives the administrators, the leaders, so much more latitude to really give money where it's needed and not just a strings attached, well, it has to go here, here, here. So as we're doing these forums, and especially tonight if you feel so called, we have a box in the back. You can also donate online if you go to our website, again at castletonumc.org. So with all that said, and without further ado, I want to ask our panelists to introduce themselves for you this evening. As I mentioned, this is talking about housing and the role of government, and we have a really nice balance, I think, of expertise and experience here on stage. So what I'm going to ask our panelists in your introduction, if you don't mind, obviously share your name and your background, but also how you got involved in where you are. And I say that as a professor who's always just innately curious. How do people come to their positions? And I think we have some really cool stories here. So Judge Bacon, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kimberly Bacon, and I'm the judge in Lawrence Township Small Claims Court. I have been on the bench now since 2015, so I'm in my 9th year going into my 10th year. Prior to me taking the bench, I was in private practice, doing general practice anywhere from family law to probate law, and I also maintained a public defender contract and did criminal law as well. And so in my work in small claims court, I would say that it really is something that I was led to from my private practice days and working as a public defender as well. And so in doing the work that I do now, I run what most people would say the eviction court, to be short and simple, along with debt collection. And so I've been doing that now for, like I said, 9 years. In 2020, after we were shut down with COVID, I had received some grant funds through the ARPA grants, or ARPA Treasury funds, and I launched what I would call an eviction diversion program for the state of Indiana. And I also served on the eviction task force after the courts were shut down and we had to reopen, and housing became one of the big issues for the Supreme Court and for the courts. While it had always been an issue, it was escalated and magnified when COVID was unfortunately taking people out, and so we had to figure out as a judicial branch how to make sure that the communities were stabilized and safe. So with that was how I launched the eviction diversion program, and I'll get into a little bit more. I don't want to keep talking right now. So.
Aaron Spiegel. Whoa. I am the Executive Director of the Greater Indianapolis Multifaith Alliance, GMA. Really, my important job is I'm the president of the Kim Bacon fan club. That's right, we all should. So how did I get into housing? Interesting story. When GMA was in its formation stage, and really the core of our work is civil dialogue, go figure. The people that were starting said we need to pick a social justice issue, which, by the way, I said was a mistake. I was wrong. So we gathered about 90 people at the Interchurch Center. Every social justice issue was on the table. You name it, gun violence, LGBTQ issues, food insecurity, and there was no second to evictions. Evictions came to the top, and that's where it was going to stay. I don't think it's a coincidence that Matthew Desmond's book had come out just before that, and if you've read it, it really makes Indianapolis look bad, which it should, but it really was a stark, there is no question this is going to be our issue. So I started drinking from the fire hose. Evictions, as far as I'm concerned, are a symptom of a disease we have in Indiana. I'll give you the elevator pitch. Lack of affordable housing, increased investment from hedge funds, out-of-state hedge funds, and Indiana law. I'm also a lobbyist, and I really like both of these legislators, and I think they're okay with me. So my job is to educate, not just us in the faith community, but also our legislators about what people are dealing with.
Yes, Rabbi Spiegel, I'm okay with you. Hi, everyone. My name is Carey Hamilton. I'm the state rep for this area. I have roughly the eastern third of Washington Township and probably western roughly third of Lawrence Township, a couple of precincts in the IPS school district as well. I want to just say I'm honored to be here with a couple of true subject matter experts and professionals in the field, distinguished panel of all around of folks that I admire and respect, including our moderator. To the question of how did I end up here, so I've been in the legislature for 8 years now. I'm wrapping up my 4th 2-year term, which is hard for me to believe. But how did I get here? My background is in public policy. When I was at Indiana University trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, towards the end of my undergrad years, fell in love with environmental policy. I had started to really appreciate our natural resources, the outdoors. I became a hiker and appreciated our state parks. But then I also started to learn about the significant toxic load in our state, the worst in the nation still today, that leads to higher rates of cancer and other problems for Hoosiers. And that brought me into the field of public policy, and most of my career has been in the environmental field. Well, really all of it, except for my legislative work that covers so many other topics. But I learned through that environmental policy work, working for state and local governments, having my own consulting firm working for state and local governments, running a nonprofit for 10 years, most recently working in the private sector with local governments on their work to mitigate climate change. So really very interesting work, but I came to understand, especially as I was interacting more at the Indiana State House, that I was passionate about a wide range of policy issues, because I came to really understand that policy is a way that we can make Indiana work better for Hoosiers. We can strengthen our communities and deliver a better quality of life for all Hoosiers if we have the right public policy in place as a framework for that in our state. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Is it on? Yes, awesome. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Roberts. I am the District 4 Indianapolis City Councilor. I was just elected in November, and I've been in office since January, so roughly 8 months now. I will say, first of all, thank you so much. Obviously, Laura and Pastor Matt, who do great work here at the church. I've been fortunate to be involved here with things at Castleton for 2 years now, roughly. Last year, even, I was involved with a lot of the Gleaners food drives, and that was an eye-opening experience for a lot of reasons. I will always remember that first one we went to, that Joe and Pastor Matt and I and many other you were there too, where it was downpouring and it was a fun experience, and it was probably not everyone's top of the list to be in a downpour for a food drive, but it was, I think, a testament to how much a lot of these volunteers really care about the community. So a little bit about me. Grew up in this area my entire life. My great-grandmother's here in the audience, lives 5 minutes down from here. She moved here back in the, after her husband, my great-grandfather, was stationed at Fort Harrison. Been here ever since, really. Very fortunate for that. Went to Lawrence North, stayed here ever since. And a couple of years ago, I started more of my direct community involvement. I got hired to the trustee's office of Lawrence Township under Steve Talley. And that was really my first involvement with a lot of housing issues. We had to work with Judge Bacon a lot on these things, and I really cannot speak enough about Judge Bacon and her leadership with things she's done at the court system. We've seen it a lot with how difficult it is sometimes to make change in that way, right? It's easy for us to say doing the right thing is easy, but it's very difficult sometimes, right? There are a lot of structural barriers to make these changes happen. But again, through that I saw a lot of it. And I started running for city council 2 years ago almost. Won my election, been on the council ever since. And really, housing is a paramount issue for the whole city, right? It affects a lot of these other issues I hear about constantly: public safety, education, even infrastructure and density and climate issues, right? A lot of these things are affected by housing and how we build our housing. I could go in more about why it's built that way. Indianapolis is a very car-dependent city. We have a lot of things that other cities don't have in terms of structural problems. So housing is very unaffordable here. Well, it's affordable compared to other cities, but we have a lot of reasons why it is more unaffordable than it needs to be if we did things a better way. But in terms of my committees I'm on, there are 12 committees we serve on as counselors that deal with the majority of work. I'm on the one that deals with housing the most. I'm on the Metropolitan Economic Development Committee, which deals with bonds and TIFs and everything that grants these housing projects. Of course, as counselors, we don't have to approve every project, but it is the way that I've really dealt with all these issues head on. And we've been supporting a lot of new projects. This last month, we had 2 new affordable housing projects we supported. But in my opinion, it's not enough. We need to continue to keep the ball rolling, continue to get more new projects. But through that, I've seen a lot of it. I've seen a lot of the struggles that these projects have, from cradle to death in terms of what they go through and the struggles they have. So I'm a big supporter of obviously more housing, affordable housing, et cetera. And I'll get more into a lot of these things in general, but through my work at the trustee's office and now working for the city council, I've seen both sides of the issue, how, sometimes it's difficult, right? And one thing I'll get into later is, people just, think that as a city we can will up new housing, but it's very difficult, right? We, as a city, cannot solve the affordable housing crisis ourselves. The private sector has to be a part of that decision-making process to have the will for them to build new housing. And we could do things on our end to make it more, just more affordable and safer and all kinds of things, but it's going to be really a team effort, and I think this is the team to do it. So I appreciate you all for being here. Appreciate you all for being passionate advocates for the subject. Hopefully you'll get some good wisdom. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Fady, Qaddoura, and I have the honor of serving this community as the State Senator for Senate District 30. Professor Wilson, thank you for hosting us today, and Pastor Matt and the entire congregation. This is an amazing congregation that I had the privilege to recognize just a few months ago for the amazing civic contributions of the community, of the members of the church to the larger community. I'll be brief. I'm here today because I'm extremely passionate about this topic, and I apologize for my delay. I was at an event on the west side of Indianapolis, serving my constituents, and with traffic on 465, it was difficult to make it over here on time, so forgive me for that. I'm extremely passionate about these topics, housing and the issue of public safety, and there are three factors that influence my passion. The first is my lived experience, the second is my professional experience, and the third is my educational experiences. On the first one, I'm extremely unique. If you've noticed, I have a very common name, Fady. I was born for a Muslim Palestinian family, went to Christian school for 12 years of my life, and I was raised in a Jewish neighborhood. So at an early age, I had to learn and embrace diversity and love and compassion towards one another. I was raised by and taken care of by a poor family. Mom and dad worked extremely hard, and I came to the United States as an immigrant with the dream of becoming the next Jeff Bezos. The good side of Jeff Bezos. The tax-paying, non-cheating husband, Jeff Bezos. So I ended up with, my dream was to pursue a bachelor's and a master's in computer science, which I did. I met my wife in 2001, and this is relevant to tonight's topic. In 2001, a few months after my wife and I met, she was born and raised in the United States. She's a third-generation American. Her family came from the same region where I came. Her brother was killed at their family business at the age of 25. So when we speak about gun violence, when we speak about crime and public safety, when we speak about the role of law enforcement and the role of the community and building trust and working on these policies and reforming the criminal justice system, these are lived experiences for my family. 2005, 3 weeks after my daughter was born, my oldest daughter was born in August, we became homeless after Hurricane Katrina. So I'm here because I walked in the shoes of a homeless person before. I can speak to you about the feelings, the agonies, the pain, the struggle, not living with paychecks, and relying on the generosity of a stranger to put food on the table for your spouse and your kid. So that triggered me to completely walk away from computer science, and I decided to spend the rest of my life in public service, to be like those who served my family during times of need. So I went to Rice University, finished a postgraduate education in executive leadership. And my professor said, if you really care about public service, IU has one of the best programs, no offense to the University of Indianapolis, but IU has one of the best programs in public service in the United States. So at that time, my wife and I had our second daughter. We have two daughters, 16 and 18. So we dragged them here, and I pursued my second master's in public administration and finance and my PhD in public policy and philanthropy, which leads me to the final point, which is my professional experiences. So my first job in the state of Indiana in 2009 was an intern in the Indiana State Senate, the same chamber that I serve in today. And I've seen the impact of laws passed by the state. And then when I was hired to be the city controller, the CFO for the city of Indianapolis, I've seen the discrepancy in understanding of the impact of public policies and laws between local elected officials and state elected officials. And there was a huge gap. Not gap in intentions of public service, it's just two different roles, two different perspectives, two different responsibilities. So my personal experience, my educational experience, and my professional work experiences led me to the conclusion that to make a change in those spaces, I must enroll myself in the political system to be sure that I challenge the system from within to bring needed reform.
So we have a range of expertise here, right? We have judicial branch and legislative. We have non-denominational communities. We have township government, state government, city government. And I think we also have a range of positions and careers, right? I was wondering if you could, and I'm just going to leave it broad. Everyone can answer this question, but if you could talk about, since you began in your particular role, right, how have you seen questions of evictions, homelessness, housing insecurity, housing affordability change in our state? What are the trends and changes you've seen since you first started paying attention to these and where we are now? Those kind of changes that you've noticed. And I'll just throw it out there for whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump in.
Awesome.
There's a statistic that I think is telling. Between 2001 and 2021, so 20 years, Indianapolis averaged 4% increase in rental prices. In the 6 months between the beginning of 21 and the middle of 22, we had 15% increases in 6 months. For me, that's almost a microcosm of the changes in housing in not just Indianapolis, but it's in the state. Again, precipitated by things like the increased investment from corporate hedge funds. By the way, Fair Housing Center has an event next week to talk about this specific thing. It is impacting everyone. It is a small subset of landlords in Indianapolis, but they are taking over. They're buying entire neighborhoods.
Could you jump, not to interrupt, but to jump into that, what's problematic with that? Because I think we hear a lot of times about
Sure.
like, oh, out-of-state landlords. And it's not directly or explicitly because they're out of state, though that does kind of lend to it. But why is that a concern? And why might that play a role in that 4% to 15%
Because
jump?
they're not real estate companies. They're investors.
They're not invested in our communities.
Exactly. And they
Or
are
the housing.
the worst violators of habitability issues. So my heat doesn't work. I call the landlord. There's nobody there. I heard just recently that some of the largest of these now are using AI to manage the rental properties. There's never a human involved. So I had a judge, I won't tell you which one, said to me, they come to Indiana with evictions as part of the business plan. It's cheaper for them to evict than it is, and because our vacancy rate is so high, they just get somebody else moving in.
So let me jump in on this, but I still want to answer the question that you laid out. So I agree with Rabbi Spiegel. Aaron, on this issue. So there are some concerns, and I have seen the change over the 10 years that I have been on the bench, roughly 10 years I've been on the bench. So where we used to have local landlords, some small, some larger, we are now seeing those hedge funds that have come in and bought the properties at a very low rate, or as a business model. They are coming in, buying the properties, depreciating it down, because you are able to evict a tenant for $102 to $104 with which is what our filing fee is currently in small claims court. And then you can turn that property over within, previously, I will say, anywhere from 5 days to 21, depending upon what court you are in. And then you're able to obtain a judgment at 8% interest. You can't do any better than that in the investment world, where you get a judgment with post-judgment interest of 8% that's good for 20 years. And then they don't go look for that person for probably anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And an individual may or may not even know that a judgment exists against them. So that's 8% interest per annum that's accumulating. That's a pretty good investment. Then they can sell the debt when they get ready to offload it, because they've depreciated it down significantly and can no longer take that tax deduction. And so they're able to sell the debt along with the property. And it is a business model for many of those hedge funds. And so that is very difficult for the community to get engaged in, because many tenants who want to come to our courts and raise the issue of habitability with the properties, oftentimes they're filing against a property manager who is not the true owner of the property. And they cannot get anything done in that property because the property manager must first go get the approval of the true owner of the property, that hedge fund, and they will just say, no, we don't want to fix it. And so now we're sitting there with a property that is not being fixed. You've got a tenant who's in a property that is not well maintained, and then you've got the issue of how do you get to the owner, the real owner of the property, because they may sell it very quickly to avoid any further litigation or any other pursuit. And so you've even got the health department that will close a claim if a tenant has been evicted. So therefore, now the person who has left this property in uninhabitable conditions or questionable habitability conditions have now been able to move on and never have to do anything. And they'll just turn it over and rent it to someone else who is in need and needs to have housing and will accept what they can get. So
One more quick statistic. Fair Housing Center, again, last year came out with a report, $15 to $20 million a month is going out of state in rental payments. That's just for single family residences. That doesn't include apartment complexes. That's that's up to $2 billion a year is leaving the state in rental.
So to answer a little bit more of the original question, one of the things that I started out by saying when I was giving my introduction was I used to be a public defender. As a public defender in doing criminal law work, and even in the family law arena, you would see, especially with pre-sentence reports with criminal cases, you would see in pre-sentencing reports, a lot of times, a lot of bright people that got caught up in the cycle of poverty, the trauma of an unstable environment that may have caused them to veer off or become engaged with a person that diverted them from being an otherwise good student, an otherwise good community member, that ultimately they were making other choices that landed them in the criminal justice center or system. So as I began to my judicial career, one of the things that I noticed was that that was a nuance that I recognized in my former work, in my practice. But when I got to the small claims court, which people don't understand quite the uniqueness of the small claims court, it is the closest court to a community. I can walk into my Walmart, my Kroger, and see people that may have appeared on Zoom or been in my court that day. So I always treat people with respect. But the fact that I see people on a daily basis in just my living in Lawrence Township makes me have empathy. Because I want my community strong. I want my community to be productive. I want my community to be thriving, where people have great opportunities. So I consider that, and I see that in my court. And I want to give everybody a fair playing field and chance to have those opportunities. So I say that to say, when I was starting to see people come through my court on a regular basis, I wanted to make sure that what I saw as a cycle of trauma, the cycle of poverty being started, what could I do differently? As Aaron talked about Evicted, the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, the statistic in that book talked about Indianapolis as being one of the highest rated eviction cities in the country, and it said 2015 was where those statistics started. That was when I took the bench. That was part of the years when I ascended to the bench, and I knew that I needed to do something different. I wanted to change the narrative. There was a different way to think about how we did a community court. And so, thank you, I appreciate that. I'm okay now, I just had a moment. But it was important for me to start rethinking how the courts, as a community court, could engage and act different and still dispense justice. Because most people don't run through the criminal justice system. And sometimes the only picture or vision of a court that they see is when they come through a small claims court. We are the picture of the judiciary. We are the picture of a court system. And so I wanted to make sure that whatever people's engagement was in that court system, they left with feeling like they were treated fairly, and they had their day in court, and they had an opportunity to be seen and heard. So that was one of the reasons why I began to change how I viewed court and how I operated it, because I wanted people to feel like they could come to court and get a resolution and not just get a rubber stamp or a process for them to go through and have to change housing in 5 to 7 days and just be out looking for somewhere new. What can we do to stabilize the community? Because what most of you may or may not know is most of the criminal cases that come through our courts are not the big ones that you see on TV. It is misdemeanors and level 6 felonies, which are what in the old days we used to call theft and misdemeanors, right? And it was for necessities. People were committing these acts for necessities, for deodorant, for food, for things that were not the big ticket items or the huge felonies that sometimes we only see on TV. Our courts get congested because of those lower level issues where people are oftentimes just trying to survive. So by trying to break those cycles of poverty and trauma and create some stabilization in a community helps the bigger parts of our justice system, which include family courts, where children may or may not be taken, where truancy occurs, where juvenile actions are committed, where, again, criminal actions are done. If you start in our courts and stabilize communities, that can help prevent consequences further down the line. So, I don't know if I answered the question. But.
That was wonderful. Yes. So to your question about how this issue really began to intersect with me as an elected official, I'll share that back in 2001 when Senator Qaddoura was relatively new in office, and we were starting to realize the travesty that was unfolding at Lakeside Point Apartments in Nora. We sent a letter to the Attorney General asking for injunctive relief with the goal of moving to, this was an instance of an out-of-state owner that was not taking care of the properties at all, such that it was truly uninhabitable, dangerous for families. These apartments with water coming down, doors broken, no heat, all of it. It was a nightmare. And so later that year, the new maps were drawn for districts, and I no longer represented that community, and so that work was left to the very able hands of Senator Qaddoura, and I suspect he'll share some of the work there. So the issue's been front and center for me since then, but I want to share something from this series. I want to thank you and your church for this incredibly important work. I came to the second panel in person and heard the statistics that 7,800 youth experience homelessness in our community every year in Indianapolis. 7,800. 7,800. So when I think about, I've been thinking, it was about 2 months ago probably, maybe a little less, and I've been thinking about my upbringing, which I was relatively very privileged, but my single working mom and my sister and I had to apartment shop several times and change school districts a few times here in Indianapolis. And that was pretty traumatic for me as a kiddo. My mom also struggled to find an affordable quality before and after school care. I became a latchkey kid and babysitter to my much younger child way earlier than we should have. It was not a good thing. I say all that to share, I understand that is nothing. That was traumatic. I have trauma because of that. I've recovered from that, but that is nothing compared to a child experiencing homelessness at any given time. Nothing. 7,800 kids in our community. I truly had no idea. That was 2 months ago. I'm an elected official in this community. I had no idea. So shame on me if moving forward, I'm not more proactive on this issue. And there's a point I want to make later that we have to get to, Laura,
I will, I promise.
about that. But I also want to share, I'm the House Democrat Caucus chair. And so thinking about our work as a caucus more broadly, I think about this issue both in some of the very specific, critically important things that we're going to hear about in this panel, but also the bigger picture issues that we need to tackle in our state that also help address this, like ensuring hardworking Hoosiers get better pay. I mean, the fact that Walmart is the largest employer of Medicaid recipients in our state is not acceptable to me. That families have access to affordable, high-quality childcare so that they can have the best paying jobs in the community because they know that their kids are in a safe place that they can afford to send them to. Obviously, healthcare is a critical piece of this, but also education and providing pre-K for all. That's a smart investment in our kids and their future. It helps families know because they have a safe place for their children to go and thrive so that they can go work and they're not paying for that out of pocket. That's I believe, a minimum. Pre-K for all is a minimum help to families that we have to provide. Only 2 or 3 other states in the nation spend as little as we do in Indiana on pre-K. Paid family leave falls in this category, helping families thrive. This isn't all we need to do, but these things would help relieve other pain points that we know we can do from a public policy perspective, from a cost perspective to families, so that housing is more affordable. Having said that, we understand we do not have enough affordable housing, and there are many public policy tools at the State House that we need to look to. I'm not going to speak to tenant protections because I know that Senator Qaddoura has become quite the expert on that. I do believe we need executive leadership on this. I know that there's been a coalition effort in our community in our state to ask the governor to put forward a commission, so a multi-year, deep analysis and reporting out mechanism where all stakeholders are at the table, not just the well-funded special interests who don't want public policy action, but all stakeholders, to start to really come up with solutions for this critical problem. And then, of course, there are things we can expand, like tax credits for low-income housing, other financial supports, making these investments that we know will help solve this problem, and that are smart investments because they help our families thrive, be part of our communities, be part of our economy, and then we all a rising tide lifts all those boats.
Yeah, and I'll add on a few things to that too, and also just as an FYI, I should have mentioned when I started, my district is in the Geis and Castleton area too, so a little bit north of here. One of the things I'll just mention, this is a bit of a personal aside, is that I have a very different perspective on housing than 99.9% of elected officials, because as you may or may not notice, I'm pretty young for my job. There are probably not a whole lot of elected officials that have not bought a house, right? So ironically, that was something that, a lot of people last year talked to me about, reason they, and fair enough, I didn't have that experience, but I think it's a strength, right? There are a lot of people in our city that have not bought a house before, and I think they are a worthwhile person to have a representative in their government who's not done the same. So I've lived these things personally, right? I lived in an apartment. I've seen the rents skyrocket, and that is the case for almost everyone in my generation. That is the number one issue I hear about from people that are my age is housing, unaffordability, apartments, spiking in rents. And Indianapolis is, as has been said, just as bad as a lot of other cities in the country. Thankfully, we're still more affordable than in New York or Chicago or in LA or San Francisco, but it's still very high. And it should go without saying, but especially if you're, a family that needs to live in a larger place, 2-3 bedrooms, it is very expensive to get apartments. I mean, the place I had was a 1-bedroom, and from 2019 until 2021 or 2022, it spiked from $700 a month to $1,100, right? Which for a lot of people, I was able to afford that. But for a lot of people, that's out of the question. It's completely unaffordable. And one of the things we've been working on as a city that I think is a smaller factor but is important, a lot of talk about out-of-state landlords, but there are a lot of out-of-state Airbnbs too, and out-of-state other entities that buy up these houses, and they take over neighborhoods, right? There are some neighborhoods in the city, Bates Hendricks, Fountain Square, around downtown, that are being basically monopolized. Anytime the house goes on the market, one of these out-of-state companies will buy it up, turn it into an Airbnb, and as a city and state, we basically have no regulation on those things. So these companies can buy them up, have no accountability. They view it as an investment, right? A lot of these properties have really disrupted neighborhoods because they're having crazy parties. People don't want to live near houses that have, a lot of these parties. And, it's great, sometimes it's great to have everything in moderation, but it's gone completely out of control. And as a city, we're beginning to regulate it. We just voted on a couple weeks ago having a landlord registry, which I think is an important step. But unfortunately, because of state policy, we're not able to regulate these things to where they should be. A lot of other cities have completely banned Airbnbs and Verbos because those things are, those pieces of housing are crucial, right? Certain neighborhoods, if you're taking out basically an entire neighborhood of housing, that is, 2,000 less houses that average people can buy up, right? And, creates even less supply for us to take advantage of. And I don't have the statistics exactly, but from 2018 until now, the usage of those things have just skyrocketed. And again, it's fine in moderation. I'm not saying we should ban them, but it's gotten out of control. And we've seen it in this area too. There was one on Fall Creek Road where there was a big shooting at a place that was being used as a party house. Other Airbnbs too, but I have a lot of empathy for people that live in those neighborhoods that are just, again, being overrun. And, it's making them unaffordable. People don't want to live there. And really, as a city and state, we need to really have accountability for these out-of-state landlords that, again, it's costing business. These properties might be trashed, but, they can make money on it, and it's not really, sometimes always a big deal for them. So having accountability locally, people that care about the areas, if you're a landlord from Indianapolis, you probably have more skin in the game than someone out of state. So for me, it's a really important thing to prioritize, and I appreciate some of our state partners. These are not the people that are not causing that progress. They're working on it, and I appreciate their work and everyone else that's really been working on this issue because it is a complex one, and there are a lot of small policy reasons why it's a really difficult place for policy and for housing right now in Indiana.
Professor Wilson, if you need more time for other questions, you can skip me.
No, you're quite fine, actually.
You sure?
Please, yes. Yeah.
I'll be brief. I'll share 2 observations. It's difficult to follow my eloquent colleagues here, but I'll take share with you a different observation. 2 points. The first, you may ask, why are we in this position in the first place? And in my view, the root cause of all political evil in the state of Indiana is the concept of gerrymandering. That concept of elected officials drawing their maps, selecting their voters, predetermining the outcomes of elections for 10 years is not what we define as a democracy. So you ask yourself, how does that impact housing? Well, that skews the agenda, the policy and political agenda at the State House to favor those from different districts. And currently, it favors rural Indiana. And I'm against dividing us into an us versus them agenda, but rather we must have a deep understanding of the issues, and in my view, surgical solutions that can give a win-win for all communities. Supporting Indianapolis does not mean that we are discrediting rural Indiana. Working on rural Indiana issues does not mean that we are taking anything from Indianapolis. So I think we're in it together. But until we fix that issue, it's difficult and it's frustrating for our voters, for our citizens to understand When someone in the audience comes to us after this event and said, or will say, I've been voting for 50 years and I'm eager to see change, and I don't feel that my vote matters anymore, it's because of gerrymandering. Now, after the event, I'll convince you that your vote matters even under a gerrymandered system. And I urge you to continue to vote and to engage others. But I want you to understand that first piece, which is the gerrymandering piece. The second and the final point is that at the State House, it's extremely important to understand the competing agendas. For any cause, for any movement that you support, your advocacy and your work also fuels the anti-movement, the anti-cause of what you're supporting. If you support immigration, you're fueling the energy for the anti-immigrants. If you support affordable housing, you're fueling the energy into the other camp. And I'm blunt, I speak from the heart, and I've been very vocal about the issue of housing and calling those who are obstacles in the face of progress. I call them out publicly, face to face, in committee, on the Senate floor, and in the news. I think if you can't stand publicly based on the merits of your ideas, then you're unworthy of governing or even advocating and using your money to lobby the State House. And I can tell you the biggest obstacle to reforms in the state of Indiana that killed my legislation twice over the last 2 years is the Apartment Association. The Apartment Association dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions on the current majority that controls the State House. And they were the ones that I met with personally and said, we don't support your legislation. So I was grateful. What I'm about to conclude with to say is a compliment, is not an insult. I love Rabbi Spiegel because he's stubborn. And his stubbornness pays off. Behind him is an army of advocates and amazing people, a coalition of communities of faith and otherwise. But at the State House, we've worked together with others, Prosperity Indiana and Housers, and we did introduce legislation, so we're not short of ideas. Different solutions have been proposed in 30 other states. Some of them date back to the 80s, like Ohio, when they had the escrow account model for tenants. So my point, the question was about trends and observations. My observation is that without deep understanding of the political system, you might be misguided by someone who might intentionally try to misinform you by telling you either we don't have solutions or that nobody's working on it. I want to assure you that there are solutions, and we are working on the solutions, and it's an uphill battle, and the root cause of that problem, one, is gerrymandering, and second, the role of money in politics.
This is a great segue to individual questions, because I wanted to ask Representative Hamilton, leading in the caucus, how do you see this?
Thank you so much. And this can be the last time I talk, so we can get around to our other folks. But it is a great segue to something I'm glad to have a moment to talk about, and that is, Senator Qaddoura lifted up the issue of gerrymandering. This is a critical threat to our democracy. We currently are serving under maps that came out in 2021 that were considered by some the most gerrymandered in the nation. And that means that it's hard to have competition in those seats. Competition for candidates, competition for ideas. And ultimately it comes down to, it really hurts debate in the State House. It also leads to extreme concentration of power that's not representative. So in the House today, we have 30 Democrats and 70 Republicans. I have friends across the aisle. I hope that there's political diversity in the room today. But I will say that long time now, 12 years of concentration of power is not good for democracy. It wouldn't be good for democracy if it were concentrated in the hands of Democrats, and it's not good as it is today in the hands of my friends across the aisle. Special interest, these are just kind of facts of this sort of dynamic when you have all of that power in one place. Special interests have more power than they otherwise would. because there's less competition in the general election. Good ideas and representative dialogue are less prevalent when it comes down to what bills are actually being heard and advanced in the legislative body. So as Senator Qaddoura just said, many good solutions have been put forward to help us start to tackle this crisis that we're talking about today, and they don't even get a hearing at the State House. So all of that, not to depress you, but I want to share with you that in the House today, we have a real opportunity to break the supermajority and bring more balance back to the State House. We just need to flip 4 seats, and we have incredible candidates running to flip 4 seats from red to blue, and actually potentially more, to, again, bring that more debate and dialogue and balance back to the State House. That's good for democracy. So thank you for indulging that point. And I want to, please come up to me afterwards if you want to learn more about that work. We need volunteers, we need folks reaching out to talk about these ideas that you're hearing tonight, that you care about, that maybe your friends in other communities where they have a chance to vote for other candidates might value learning about. It's a critical moment for us in Indiana. If we want to move the needle more on this issue in the 2025 legislative session, we need to have more of a voice at the State House. And one final point, breaking the supermajority means that Democrats are in the room and have to be heard. That's kind of the super summary of it. Today, our friends across the aisle could do business without us in the building, without a single Democrat in the building. And then a very final point about representation. In Indiana today, depending on which political scientist you ask, it could be that Indiana's maybe 42 or 45% Democrat. Well, in the House, we're only 30% because of those gerrymandered maps. In the Senate, it's what, 22%? I mean, that's not representative, and we need representative government to work for us and to help our communities thrive. Thank you.
So, to 2 points, I cannot be political, except for every 4 years, so I'm going to step away from that for a little bit. But having said that, I believe in trying to present a conversation in a manner in which that piques the other side's interest, right? So I'm very appreciative for the legislation that you've put forth, Fady, with respect to trying to do, if I may call you Fady, the appeal bonds and making sure that there are escrow counts, that so that tenants have somewhere to put their money while they're going through litigation. I think that that's very important. But if we are unable to get that done, then we also have to work towards another outside solution. And I know that there are maybe other corporate interests that may be willing to set up accounts for people to place their funds there while they're going through litigation, so that those funds can then be distributed to a landlord once they come through a court. I mean, I think that those types of things we have to think about. If we can't get the policy done, we have to look for other ways to create those solutions. And that's why I appreciate Aaron so much, because he oftentimes is trying to come up with that additional solution. And while I recognize it cannot change at this time, but the fight is good, and we understand that you will continue to fight, you and Carey both. The other opportunities that need to be understood as we're talking about improving and stabilizing our community, our city, is the fact that I think Indianapolis is the biggest city. Most conventions and conferences want to come here for their programs and their conventions. Indianapolis needs to have a working class that can afford to live in Indianapolis. And that's the reality. Right now we don't have a transportation system that allows them to get around through the city. And if they're stuck in a donut county because they can only afford a place to live in a donut county, that hurts the city of Indianapolis. That hurts the revenue that can be generated for our city in order for us to be able to attract new people to come, whether it's from a Lilly, a Cummins, or anywhere else, or from a Gen Con that just came here. Because the reality is that right now, rent is outpacing wages. A person needs to make no less than $16 an hour, right, to just earn approximately $31,000 a year. That's still barely living in Indianapolis right now, unfortunately. And if you add a child to that, we're now below poverty once again, right? So just those simple mathematics makes it very clear what is necessary to assist the community in getting back on its feet, but making sure that everybody has that stability, trying to get those wages up, trying to find and keep housing affordable. But we have to do that because just because just because one person comes through court, on average, there's probably 2 children in that household. And so now we're affecting a school system, the Lawrence Township school system, which if that child leaves our township, that money goes with that child, which now impacts our school system, right? If that child has an IEP, is that how you say it? Then that child has to stay in the school that they're currently in while they may be living completely across town. And then that school system has to figure out, which costs money, how to get that child from across town back to that school until all of that can be worked out. It is a cycle. It is a systematic situation that if we start at the core through good legislation, that we can make a difference. That we definitely can make a difference. We can break the cycles of poverty and distress and trauma, but we can also make good government, we can make a good state, and we can draw in business, right? And when I do my eviction diversion programs, I try and work with landlords to say $1 today is better than $1 you're trying to collect 20 years down the line because people have bankruptcies, illness, death, and disability. Work with me now through the court system so that we can get funds to you and we can keep a person housed and you don't have to spend an additional $7,000 to turn over another property and get a new tenant who you may be back in the same situation in 2 to 3 months, right? So we have to think about the verbiage differently, even though we're trying to get to the same goal, because I think your idea of escrow is wonderful, so.
Awesome. I love that Judge Bacon called out Rabbi Aaron in terms of solutions, because that's actually one of the next questions I had was, I think we've identified several levels and layers of problems, but this would be a very depressing panel, and I don't want it to be a very depressing panel if we only talked about the problems. So could you share with us some of the solutions that you've seen and some of the, especially communities of faith, working together to approach those?
Sure. And I don't want to use the word solutions because that's too hard. But we can take action. You know, GMA is about civil dialogue. That's the basis from where we come. And with all due respect to Carey and Fady, we do live in a state with a supermajority Republican legislature. And you know what? We need to talk to them. I've spent the last 3 years talking almost exclusively to Republican legislators. And if I'm going to follow my own advice, my own rules, I have to be civil. And you know what? They're good people. I don't agree with a lot of the things that they say. They don't agree with me. But we need to talk to them. And you all I see people I know that are from multiple congregations. Sister Malia's here, from multiple faiths. We have to stop going in there like this. We have to stop doing this. Activism is one thing, but activism without a strategy, without an advocacy strategy, does not do anything but piss them off. I've had legislators tell me, when you all come and yell at me, I'm going to do the opposite. They haven't graduated from middle school. When we come in with a unified voice, with civility and with respect, we can have a conversation. We might not get what we want right away, and here's the rub. It's hard. It's slow. Fady says I'm stubborn. Yes, I am stubborn. And you know what? I also believe in the goodness of people. They're trying to do the right thing. I will tell you, my faith community brothers and sisters, they want to talk to me about how their faith influences their decision making. Think about that for a second. A lot of times I just sit there and bite my tongue, but no, I'm just kidding. They want to talk about this stuff. They're our neighbors too. We have an incredible amount of power, we being the faith community, but we are not organized, and we are not speaking in a unified voice. We're yelling is what we're doing, and cut it out. And I'm going to give you an action step, something you can do in a couple weeks. On August 20th, this is a shameless self-promotion, we are one of 5 organizations that is sponsoring the Indianapolis premiere of Beyond the Bridge, a solution to homelessness. It's at Clues Hall. We need to fill Clues Hall. 2,000 people. Why do we need to fill Clues Hall? Not because everybody needs to see the movie, but because our city won't do the right thing. We have everything we need. Everything is in place to solve chronic homelessness in less than 3 years. Jim Mathy from Milwaukee said to me, we could do this in 6 months. But we have to have the political will to say this is what we're going to do. And the only way we're going to do that is to show the city, give the message unequivocally that we must do this. You don't have a choice. You work for us. So you can do this. Show up and see a movie. How hard is that? Plug over.
Awesome. We received several questions from the audience, and I'm also cognizant of time, but I want to do right by everyone that submitted questions. And it sounds like we're saying we need to work with both sides of political parties and also at multiple levels of government. And so, Councilor Roberts, I wanted to ask you, we got a question asking about the City County Council and what they do to look into issues of affordable housing, eviction crisis, rent gouging, habitability issues, and out-of-state investors. And I know we talked about some of those, and you also mentioned Airbnb. So as we discuss some opportunities for state-level solutions, what do we see going on in Indianapolis in terms of solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really it's the million-dollar question. Again, this is the issue that I hear most about and I think about most right now. I'll just say first and foremost, this is a part of where it gets complicated with government, right? People just assume that as the city council, we manage everything that falls within our boundary as a city, the schools, healthcare within Marion County sometimes, all these different issues. And they can talk about it just as much as I can. But the reality is Indianapolis is a very unique structured city because we are a city-county council, and there's only one city-county council in the entire state. What's difficult about it, we are also, it's kind of complicated, there are 3 classes of cities in Indiana. Cities under 50,000 people roughly, from like 50,000 to like 250,000 people, and cities over 250,000 people. We are the only class 1 city in Indiana. So the State House can regulate Indianapolis as much as they want constantly. So there are specific laws that are only applied to Indianapolis in terms of housing that we cannot do these certain things because they tell us we cannot, right? And I wish it were not the case, but it's just the reality. And that's the case for a number of different topics, whether it's transit, obviously housing is a big one too. even certain crime issues. But there are things we want to do. There's some councils who want rent control, right? We are not allowed to do that as a city. Some people want to regulate the Airbnbs more. We're not allowed to do certain things either. So there's a lot of limited structural capacity we have as a city that is deferred to the state. And thankfully, we have some good partners of the state working with us of both parties. They're helping out these things. But there are also, the township courts, right? We are extremely fortunate to have Judge Bacon in Lawrence Township. I cannot emphasize this enough. But the reality is, the tough thing is that a lot of these landlords that are very strict on evictions can just go send their cases to other parts of the county. If they don't like what she's doing, all right, we'll send our courts to a different place. And what's nice about our area is it's close, right? It's the court to the people. And people can walk there, they can drive there. I see it every day at work. People walk right to the small claims court. But if they move these cases downtown or a different part of the city, there's no transit to get out there sometimes. It makes it really, really difficult for people to show up to their cases. So there's, unfortunately, as a city, we cannot regulate that part of the process. It's a state level procedure. So it is very difficult for us to do what things we want to do. So I would just, again, emphasize all of that. We are working on things. Thankfully, as a city, we're building the first no barrier shelter. It's easy for us, of course, to, as people that are probably not homeless, to think about it from a very narrow perspective, what we view homelessness to be. But it's a very broad range of people, right? There's a lot of families, as has been mentioned before. There are people that have dogs, or a lot of people have animals, and a lot of these current shelters that are in place in the city, a lot of them are single-gendered, right? They are no animals allowed. They are not accepting of people that have different, if they're LGBT sometimes, they're not a certain faith. So it is very difficult for families as one to go into a shelter. And we are really trying with this new shelter we're building on the Near East Side to make it inclusive for people so everyone can be there. And it's very, very difficult. There's stories I hear from our IMPD officers who do this work of homelessness outreach. They talk about how there's people they meet who have dogs, and because the shelters don't accept dogs, they stay out there because it's not an issue for them. Or if they have a drug issue, a lot of these shelters are which I understand why they're that way, but it's very difficult for people to wean off these drugs if there's not a way to get them out of transition off drug use. So it's a very complicated situation, but I think with having the no barrier shelter, it will do immense help for getting people in a point to transition. But it'll take a couple of years to build. But I'll also give a shout out real quick too. Again, we have a very fortunate of the Judge Bacon, but also the Lawrence Township school system too. I know Ms. Bush was here from the school system a few weeks ago, but also I'll give a really quick shout out. I know he probably doesn't want me to do this. Neil Gore, there's Ms. Bush actually. Neil Gore back there in the back too. He's at Harrison Hill, does a lot of this work too. I've talked a lot with, thankfully, each of the Lawrence Township schools has a family liaison, and those family liaisons work a lot with families dealing with housing issues, among other things, and talking to them about what they are doing, the proactive steps they're taking in these schools where we live to work on these issues is just amazing. And we've been fortunate to give them some support. But they're the ones dealing with these issues on a personal level, right? Imagine being get back to what you were saying earlier, imagine being a family that's being evicted on a Monday, then on a Wednesday you have to show up to a new house, new apartment, new school system, right? That is a lot of trauma to go through. We wonder why these kids aren't doing well in school. Well, if you're in a new school system in the middle of October with no curriculum knowledge of what's going on, that is an extremely hard thing to transition into. So we have, again, two great with the judge and then the school system that are really proactively working on these things. And we are, at least I am, in the 8 months I've been in it, really trying to make sure the city does whatever we can to work on these issues really directly. So appreciate the time, appreciate the question.
I want to ask another question related to that, because this was a community question submission regarding the Grants Pass decision by the Supreme Court recently. And if you're not familiar, Grants Pass is a city in Oregon, essentially one of many cities throughout the country is criminalizing homelessness. And they made it against the law. You couldn't be in a park laying down between certain hours, and you would start to be fined and you would accumulate a criminal record. And so this went to the Supreme Court, and ultimately they upheld the city of Grants Pass. My constitutional law class in the spring did this as part of their moot court experience, so I had them read all of the briefs because a lot of cities were very interested in this. And the question we received from a community member was asking, with the recent Grants Pass decision of the Supreme Court, could you talk about how you see our community? They asked about Indiana and Indianapolis, but I would say we have a lot of different constituencies represented here. Where do you see us going with this, given that 6-3 decision to uphold a city's right to do that I'll just toss that out to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I want to be clear. It's the city's right to do that. It doesn't mean they're going to do it. I think what's more concerning to me is that LA County just is going to follow through with this. Because I'm weird and I'm stubborn. I see this as an opportunity, and I've talked with others, advocates in the homeless space. The judicial system and the police departments do not want to arrest homeless people. They don't have the time or the bandwidth. So this is a great opportunity for us to say, okay, let's end homelessness. We can do it. The solution to homelessness is permanent supportive housing. We know it, and it's cheaper than what we do now. So let's use this horrible decision to motivate to solve the problem. And I guarantee you, IMPD and the Sheriff's Department and the judges will be thrilled because they do not want to deal with this. It's not a solution.
So, my friend, I would completely agree with you that this is an opportunity to have a larger conversation. But I will also say that I think with that decision, what you might find in the future is that it will quickly go away or get rectified, because if you know that jails are already overcrowded, to have people arrested and having to be incarcerated for an offense that's nonviolent, that will create a even larger overcrowding of the jails and the judicial system. So I don't know that it will be a long-term solution, which is why I believe that my friend is on the right track for why a conversation needs to be opened now for that, because of the impact. And from a General Assembly perspective, and they look at the number of judges that are around the state because they're managing the budget of state court judges, I think that to have that kind of legislation come through, I think that that will create a larger impact on what you all will have to fund or do for the judiciary. Because the more people that are going through the judicial system requires more judges. So I think that there are a lot of open conversations that can be had.
The reality is, Representative Hamilton and I were just talking about this, is you should know about the Cicero Institute out of Austin, Texas. Their solution to homelessness is to criminalize the homeless, literally, is to put them in encampments and shelters where they can't get out. They did a push through the Midwest this year, in 2024, Wisconsin, Indiana, and I believe Illinois. It was introduced in the House in Indiana. Fortunately, didn't go anywhere. They will be back, and they have hired a lobbyist, a pretty influential one. So while I'm not worried about Grants Pass, I am definitely worried about the Cicero Institute. And they have some very powerful money in Indiana behind them.
I'll just add to that, learning about this Cicero Institute just earlier today, and then Aaron bringing it up earlier when we were talking. I'm alarmed. In Kentucky, the bill they passed actually has kind of a stand your ground element to it, where if, say, I lived in Kentucky, I wake up and there's a homeless person asleep in my front yard, I can shoot them and kill them. Yeah, that's the law in Kentucky, thanks to Cicero Institute. So we need to be alarmed as Hoosiers that they've got a lobbyist coming to our state house. And I so appreciate how you're thinking about the Grants Pass decision in terms of this opportunity to heighten this conversation quickly and start to talk about solutions. We're not only heading into a session where this sort of legislation will be lifted up by powerful lobbyists, but we're heading into a budget cycle. It's going to be a tough budget cycle, but this is when we spend money on things. So it's up to us to make sure that our colleagues, and hopefully not in the supermajority in the House, understand that there are some things we need to invest in, and they're smart investments. I'm going to just go back one more to this point of supermajority. And Aaron also brought up, I have a lot of friends across the aisle. I certainly do not mean to demonize the Republican Party. I want to reiterate, supermajorities are bad, whoever's in control. That dynamic that's created with that, when I say concentration of power, it's not just a party, it's the few people within that party, the few people who are also in charge of raising money for more and more races and seats to defend. That's when the special interests get more power, special interests like this institute that's bringing this bill with this lobbyist. So that's another reason why to think about, how critical this year is from an electoral perspective.
As we wind down our conversation, we talked about challenges, barriers, we've discussed some solutions, and subtly I've gotten many suggestions, like what can you do? But I think it's always my favorite end cap for a conversation like this, because as you can see, we have a wide range of folks. You're obviously interested, right? You're here. And if you're like me, I attend things like this and I'm like, okay, what's something reasonable I can do, right? Busy mom of three, I can watch a movie, right? I certainly can vote, I promise I do, right? We've talked about a couple of those things, but if you wouldn't mind, what's your best advice to folks that are here? And I know we have a lot of people that watch these recordings and are watching them live. How can they be involved in the solutions and the ways that we can address this issue?
I'll say quickly, a big shout out to Pastor Landry for what this church is doing. Yes. And I don't mean this convening. I mean, they're actually taking action. They're doing something. At the minimum, they're talking about it. So I would challenge you all to go back to your congregations and say, why aren't we doing this? And if the answer is anything other than what you wanted to hear, start it yourself. This is, as a consultant in the congregational world for 23 years, I'm stunned by the level of fear that drives pastors, rabbis, imams, because we focus on keeping the doors open and not what's happening outside. Well, let's focus on what's happening outside, and that'll keep the doors open.
One quick comment that I'll make as an observation from my 8 months on the city council is the people that are affected by these policies are not the ones going to the State House lobbying. They're not the ones reaching out to their legislators. They're not the ones coming here today, quite frankly. It is very difficult on these issues to advocate for people because sometimes the influential lobbyists and the moneyed interests and other people that have control are the ones making the decisions. They have their relationships, but the people that are affected most by this aren't in the room to make the decisions, right? I'll say once again, I'm 23 years old, right? The amount of friends I have that have bought a house is basically zero, right? It is very difficult to, and those are the people that are not reaching out to me. The people that are reaching out to me are the ones that have it made, and most of the legislators too. I mean, these issues are, they might see the end effects of them, but if you have a house, you're living good, like it's not really an issue that affects you, right? There's an unfortunate, I think, a perception problem that these issues only affect the people that are homeless sometimes, and that these solutions will only affect their lives meaningfully, and that, unless, if you're in an apartment, like, it sucks for you, but, I have my nice little house, it's great, right? But I think to reaching out to your legislators, letting them know this issue you care about, I'm sure you can find ways it affects you too, right? It might affect a family member, might affect a friend, not just homelessness, but people that live under, the poverty level that, can barely afford housing. I mean, they're on the brink of, that potentially, and it can be a really scary situation. So I appreciate you all for being here, because this is, again, I think a lot of times in politics, people really only focus or put effort on the issues that affect them personally. And that's the very difficult part, is to get people to care about an issue that does not affect them directly is very challenging. So I appreciate you all for being here, and continue to let your legislators, whether city, state, federal, know this is a priority, and ask them what they're doing to find solutions on this, because there has to be some accountability, as was said, with this issue, because we have to work on it, and I think that's just one step we can take to make this change happen. Thank you.
First, I think even though every time I sit next to Nick, I feel older, I get inspired by knowing that we have young servant leaders who are willing to take the task. So I appreciate Nick, and I hope that we can recruit more young people that can, carry the baton and move forward, because this is generational. It's not a one-time thing. If you look at the history of our nation over the last 400 years, the history of our nation is a history of progress and setbacks, but we hope in the longer term that we have more progress than setbacks. So it requires patience, strength, dedication, systematic way of thinking. To conclude on a positive thought, I think I want to emphasize the point of civility and solutions. It was civility that allowed us to secure $20 million for Indianapolis last budget cycle for the Low Bay Area homeless shelter. It was civility, and through the work of this congregation and many others across the state of Indiana, that allowed us to secure over $200 million for the first time in over 30 years to dedicate it for mental health services, which impacts housing and violence. It was because of civility that for the first time in over 20 years, we added more than $200 million to public health. It was because of civility and working across the aisle that we passed Senate Bill 2 last session that expands the infrastructure of childcare in the state of Indiana. It was because of civility that even we did not get progress made on the legislative side. I don't want you to leave thinking that we are partisan hacks who are, driven by ideology, who don't care except about party. I will stand against the Democratic Party if they are on the wrong side of history, and I have no problem with that. And I will do the same with my friends on the other side. Unfortunately, nowadays, because of the partisan environment, it makes it look like we are constantly fighting, but it's not the case. The news reports 5 to 10% of what we fight on. It's not good for business to report the 90% of what we work on every single day. But let me tell you, for example, what might seem nowadays as a radical example of civility. I know that most of you love Todd Rokita, and that was sarcastic. Come on, we have to end with a sense of humor and a little bit more lighthearted comments. If you do love him, by all means, the Bible encourages us to love everyone. And if you don't, it's okay. We can work with each other across the aisle. But Representative Hamilton mentioned it. Lakeside Point apartment complex in my district off of 91st and College. It was a foundation, nonprofit foundation from New Jersey called JPC. And JPC abused Indianapolis for so many years. And we went to Todd Rokita. I met with him in person. We spent hours and hours and hours. And his office have professional staff that he did not recruit them. They've been working there for many, many, many years under different attorney generals, who some of them deeply care. One of them is Chase. Chase is the director of Homeowners Protection Unit. And we worked with him day and night on solutions that informed my legislation on housing protection. But Todd Rokita became the unlikely supporter from the other side to this cause. And he jumped on that opportunity, worked with the mayor of Indianapolis, because JPC abused 3 additional properties in the city. And guess what? It took 3 years. We agonized working on this case for 3 years. And recently we got a conclusion on that case. JPC was banned from working in Indiana for 7 years. They had to dissolve all of their assets, liquidate and pay back the creditors. And just 2 days ago, I was part of interstate group of advocates who continued to work on this issue. And a couple of days ago, we heard that the federal government went after JPC, shut them. There are cases that are going to be prosecuted federally because they operate in multiple states. You might not know all of these details, but that's progress. It was because of civility that we worked across the aisle to get things done. Now, that didn't solve the root cause of the problem, which is a General Assembly that is tilted more towards preserving the rights of, which I'm not opposed to, preserving the rights of homeowners and responsible homeowners and corporate landlords. We're just saying we need a balance to also protect tenants' rights. And all of it is connected. What is the point of building homes if they're not affordable? What is the point of building apartment complexes if people can't afford it? What is the point if we are incarcerating people in jails every single day taking all of their tools that they have in life, from employment to anything else, and then crippling them and then pushing them back on the street and then asking, why aren't they productive members of our community? Because our laws crippled them in the first place. But civility is what got us to this point, to be able to preserve the blue line that was under attack last session, and we protected it and we preserved it. So I don't want you to leave from here thinking that there's no hope or place for civility. We work across the aisle, and we do respect our colleagues. And I have to put myself as a person who had to work on high or graduate degree level type of papers. We had to critique each other to understand the strength of our ideas. So I'm comfortable being critiqued by my Republicans for my ideas, and I'm comfortable critiquing them. To conclude on a hopeful message, I'm a student of history, and Dr. King is my role model. And he was the face of the movement. There were thousands of people behind the movement that created the atmosphere for him to lead. But one of the most impactful moments in his life that till today, it gives me goosebumps every time I listen to it, were the last few words that he shared 6 or 7 hours before he was assassinated. Do you know which city was he assassinated in? Memphis. Do you know what was he doing in Memphis? He was there for the sanitation workers. We're talking today about homelessness. He was there for the sanitation workers, the forgotten, the vulnerable, the weak, the working class. And he said, he didn't sugarcoat it, but he left with a message of hope. He said, we have difficult days ahead. And I might not be there with you, but I've made it to the mountaintop. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. And we as people will make it to the promised land. And I promise you, if you have friends who live in other districts, call them and tell them, can you reach out to your Republican colleague or representative, meet with them over coffee, urge them to understand what their constituents are going through, and let's build that coalition. My name is Fady. In Arabic, it means Jesus, the sacrificer. I came from the promised land. And I'm here to tell you, I'm not Jesus, but there's hope. And I urge you to believe in the power of hope, because these amazing leaders, and with your thoughtful leadership and servant leadership, I promise you, things will change in Indiana. Thank you.
That's such a great point to end on. And then I just want to be tacky and answer my own question, which was, if you were looking for another way to be involved, if these weren't already great suggestions, I would remind you about volunteering at Gleaners maybe next Tuesday. We're doing this throughout August. And we heard about civility and empathy. And I'll tell you, before school started, my son and I had the opportunity to volunteer. And I was surprised how many familiar faces I saw. And not actually people I knew. I didn't know anyone. But just I would see an older couple, and it reminded me of my grandparents that needed food. And then we would see a mom with children, and I thought of my own kids. And so just to add that to your list as you're writing down different opportunities and ways that you can be a part of the solution. Throughout August, our church is involved with this Gleaners food distribution, and I highly recommend it as an incredible experience for nurturing civility, empathy, and of course, change. Can we have one more round of applause for our... Yes.
So I wanted to just quickly, I think Fady spoke eloquently, and I'm not going to be anywhere near as eloquent. However, I would like to encourage you all, because you all have been great if you have been through the courts as court watchers, and for those of you who have not, please come through and watch the courts. But I want you all to know that your presence is important. It has been impactful. And while you may not see change right away, I want you all to know that it does happen. So when I started in Lawrence with our eviction diversion initiative, we were one court in the whole state. And then after that, because of what we were doing and making a difference, there were other smaller counties that began to change things, and 3 other counties changed what they were doing. And then we were recognized nationally for what we were doing, and we got additional grant money, and 6 other courts in Marion County joined us. And it was because you all were in the courts as court watchers, the community was speaking out, so it does make a difference. And then we have added just another court in the last 2 weeks. So now we have 8 out of the 9 courts in Marion County that are all working under the Eviction Diversion Initiative. So please note that what you are doing is important. If you have a chance to participate, please get out and do so. And even on the General Assembly level, please make sure that you reach out to Fady or Carey so that you are able to see what committees are important for you all to go sit in on and engage in that conversation. I think what you said about if you have a relative in another county, make sure that you talk to that relative so that you can get to know their representative. All of those things may be incremental in your mind that may not pay off right away, but they do make a difference. And I would just hope that you realize that things are changing. Even though the ground may feel like it's moving too slow, it is happening, and things are being recognized. Our work is being recognized, and changes are coming about, no matter how you feel about them not being fast enough. So please, continue to do what you're doing, and thank you for having me, and please come out or volunteer with Aaron so that you all can get organized. But it does have impact, so thank you again.
Can I actually add one reminder?
I didn't answer that last question. If I could just, so very quickly, and I hate following these eloquent colleagues here, I do want to kind of double down, if you will, on Fady, my dear friend Fady's comment about civility. One of the greatest honors of my legislative career is receiving the Civility Award from the retired members of the General Assembly, and it's near and dear to my heart to always be civil in the legislature. And I think it's important to share that in the context of my earlier comments, because they do fit together. I have many good friends. First of all, some of the most rewarding work I've done in the legislature has been extremely bipartisan. And I will always cherish that and always continue to do that. I think all of us in the body understand, whether they agree with my goal of bringing more balance or not, that there's not as much civility and bipartisanship today as there could and should be. I have many friends who are Republicans in the legislature, in the community, who are supporting this goal because they understand it's good for democracy, and it's not about picking on a party. It truly is not. I have family members and friends who are in the other party. So that's just to be very, very clear about that. And I'll just close with saying thank you to this church, to wonderful Reverend Matt, and everyone here for facilitating such a thoughtful series of conversations over the last couple of months.
I forgot to mention, if you would like to stay updated for State House work that Representative Hamilton and I do, please follow us on social media. We are on X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, what else? Threads, all of the above. And then subscribe to our weekly or bi-weekly newsletter, because a lot of stuff that we're talking about today are things that every 2 weeks we send a newsletter saying, here's what we're working on. So that's one good way of being engaged. And then finally, I would urge all of us to give a huge round of applause for our facilitator, for Professor Wilson, for amazing work inside and outside the church. Thank you.
As we end this evening, actually, in addition to thanking our panelists, I've had a couple quick thank yous as well. I want to thank Pastor Matt, Linda Bailey, Catherine Lowhide. I have Joe Garrison for our governance committee. I'm really proud to be a part of a congregation that doesn't just talk the talk, they walk the walk. And I'm so grateful for that. I wanted to thank Miss Fran and the other wonderful helpers watching my youngest children in the nursery. And then just a super quick shout out to the tech team, which includes my husband, and we celebrated our 7th anniversary last year. And then my son, Liam. And I told my husband, I was like, are you sad? This is the last time you get to produce me. I do TV with other producers, but not with my husband. And he said he's been producing me for the last 7 years. So we can give him a hard time for that later. What can I say? I'm a work in progress. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and thank you for participating in this conversation. I hope we have more action and more conversation in the future. Drive safely.